On a cold December evening in 2000, what should have been an ordinary night of friends gathering in Wichita, Kansas, turned into a gruesome nightmare. It was a crime spree that would shake the city to its core. It was a story of senseless brutality, survival, and an unrelenting pursuit of justice. Two brothers, Reginald and Jonathan Carr, raised in a life of neglect, abuse, and crime, would go on to commit some of the most heinous acts in Wichita's history. They would force a group of innocent friends to endure unimaginable horrors before executing them in the snow. Only one would live to tell the tale. Then, in a second case, we have Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, another pair of incredibly evil brothers who were responsible for the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, which killed 3 people and injured hundreds. Keep watching to find out how these two pairs of killer brothers came to become the despicable monsters that would one day destroy lives. Reginald and Jonathan Carr grew up in Dodge City, Kansas, in an environment that was filled with violence and instability. Their mother, Janice Harding, was strict and emotionally distant. She was not the kind of mom who could provide them with love or stability, so they grew up without these things. Their father was absent, and their stepfather was abusive. At one point, he even held a gun to their mother's head to threaten her. It was the kind of traumatizing childhood that nobody deserves. The brothers grew up witnessing constant domestic violence, suffered from physical abuse, and were forced to fend for themselves, even when it came to finding food to eat. Reginald became a troublemaker and dropped out of school. It was then that he went from committing petty crimes to violent offenses. Jonathan, while he wasn't as outwardly aggressive as his brother, still suffered from deep emotional trauma. This caused him severe depression and other mental health issues. When he was just 16 years old, he attempted to take his own life by drinking antifreeze, but did not end up being successful. By the time they reached adulthood, the brothers were completely immersed in a life of crime. Reginald had already served time in prison, and Jonathan, though not as much of a hardcore criminal as his brother, was being more and more affected by Reginald's influence. Their early lives were a tragic taste of the monsters they would one day become, and the horrors they would unleash upon the city of Wichita. It was on December 8, 2000 when the Carr brothers would go on a brutal rampage unlike anything Wichita had ever seen. It would destroy lives, break apart families, and would change the city forever. They began by targeting a man named Andrew Schreiber. He was a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach who had stopped at a convenience store and was simply minding his own business. Armed and aggressive, the brothers forced him at gunpoint to get into his own vehicle and made him drive to several ATMs to withdraw a total of $800. Throughout the terrifying ordeal, Schreiber did everything the brothers asked, just hoping it would save his life. Before eventually abandoning him in an isolated area, the Carr brothers shot out his car tires to prevent him from trying to go get help. Miraculously, Schreiber survived the ordeal, was able to contact the cops, and provided a description of the men who attacked him. But at that point, the cops thought this was just an isolated incident, a couple of petty thieves who were just trying to make a couple bucks through a robbery. They had no way of knowing the horror that was yet to come. Just 3 days later, on December 11th, the brothers struck again. This time they targeted a woman named Ann Walenta. She was a 55-year-old cellist with the Wichita Symphony Orchestra. That night, after returning from a rehearsal, Ann parked in front of her upscale suburban home just like she always did. As she gathered her belongings, she noticed a man approaching her vehicle, claiming to need help. She sensed that danger was coming and got back in her car and attempted to drive away. Tragically, it was too late. Reginald Carr pulled out a gun and fired multiple shots into the driver's side window. The glass shattered, and bullets struck Ann multiple times as she collapsed in excruciating pain. Despite everything, Ann showed amazing strength. Somehow she managed to lean on her car horn, creating a loud, persistent noise that caught the attention of a neighbor. First responders rushed to the scene, and Ann, though she was critically wounded, was able to give the cops a brief description of her attacker. For a moment, it seemed she might survive. Tragically, though, on December 13th, she succumbed to her injuries. The news of her death shocked the community, and the city of Wichita mourned the loss of a beloved musician.
Ann Walenta, a local cellist, was injured in a separate attack and died later at the hospital.
But still, Wichita was unaware that this was just the beginning. December 14th of 2000 would be the night of an unimaginable tragedy that would become known as the Birchwood Massacre. That evening, 5 close friends gathered at a triplex on Birchwood Drive in Wichita. Their names were Jason Beaufort, Brad Haka, Aaron Sander, Heather Muller, and another woman who was identified only as Holly G. She was Jason's girlfriend. The evening was peaceful. They had dinner, watched television, and enjoyed each other's company. A completely unspeakable danger was lurking nearby, but right outside, both Reginald and Jonathan Carr were scouting for their next victims and planning an attack. At 11 p.m., as Jason and Holly settled into bed, they heard muffled voices. They figured it was just their friends talking, so they ignored it. But suddenly, the front door was violently kicked open. In an instant, their world shattered. Two masked men stormed into the house, waving guns and barking orders. The friends were yanked from their rooms and forced into one room at gunpoint. That was when what would become hours of torture and terror officially began. The Carr brothers demanded cash, jewelry, and ATM cards. They split up, with one brother taking Aaron and Brad to withdraw money from ATMs while the other remained behind to guard the hostages. When the first group returned, the violence escalated to unspeakable levels. The Carrs forced their victims to take their clothes off and violate each other. All the while they watched, laughing. They subjected the women to brutal sexual assault, alternating between psychological torment and physical violence. The cruelty seemed endless. Finally, after hours of terror, the brothers made their final move. The five friends were all forced into two vehicles and driven to an empty soccer field on the outskirts of Wichita. It was freezing cold with snow covering the ground. The captives were ordered to kneel in a line. HG whispered to Heather, "They're going to shoot us." But there was nothing that could be done, and no one to save them. One by one, the Carrs shot them execution style in the head, their bodies falling into the snow. But they weren't done yet. The Carr brothers wanted to be extra sure they were dead, so they drove over their bodies with a truck before leaving them behind in the snow. But what the brothers didn't realize was that one of their victims, Holly, had survived. The only reason that Holly managed to survive was because the bullet had hit her hair clip, deflecting the shot. Though seriously injured, she lay still, pretending to be dead until she was sure the Carr brothers had left. She gathered every ounce of strength and crawled for miles through the freezing snow toward the distant lights of a farmhouse. When she finally reached the door, she pounded on it until the homeowners let her in. Holly, still covered in blood and gasping for air, told them everything that she had just endured. Her incredible bravery would bring the Carr brothers to justice. Holly's testimony led the cops to the gory crime scene, where they discovered the bodies of her friends. The crime shocked even the most experienced investigators. Within days, both Reginald and Jonathan Carr were arrested. The trial was a national spectacle. Prosecutors charged the brothers with 113 counts, including capital murder, rape, kidnapping, and robbery. The defense argued for leniency because of their troubled upbringing. Ultimately, though, the jury was unmoved and convicted them, and the brothers would be sentenced to death. But shockingly, the story doesn't end there. In July 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned the Carr brothers' death sentences. The family members of the victims were extremely upset and released a public statement.
First of all, I'd like to say that extreme disappointment and disgust amongst our family and the rest of the families by the action of the Kansas Supreme Court. We're all aware that there's plenty of corrupt and misguided activities that occur with our elected officials. But it's very disheartening that even our Supreme Court in the state of Kansas have allowed themselves to be politically driven by their own motivations to control their decisions to uphold the law. The Supreme Court should not be our fail-safe to ensure that these laws are upheld. Their job is not to create or change laws. Their attempts to do so have resulted in the Supreme Court of the United States overruling multiple times. We should not allow for this above and beyond, above the law mentality to go unchecked by the people of Kansas.
Meanwhile, people across the nation tuned in to see the Carr brothers arrive in the courtroom for the first time in many years.
Reginald and Jonathan Carr will be in court next week. The Carr brothers were sentenced to death after being convicted of capital murder and for killing 5 people and injuring another in 2000. Both of them have filed motions asking for a new sentencing hearing. Those arguments are set to begin Monday morning at 10 o'clock.
But unfortunately for the brothers, the judge would end up denying the request for a new sentencing hearing.
Jonathan Carr, the younger of the two brothers, did appear in court today. His brother Reginald waived his right to be here. Today, separate lawyers for the brothers argued that back in 2002, the judge did not properly read the sentence for one of the capital murder courts in court. District Attorney Mark Bennett argued the judge was clear when the sentencing happened. Chief Judge Jeffrey Gehring said he doesn't have the jurisdiction to resentence. and he denied the motion for a new sentencing hearing.
It was the United States Supreme Court that overruled the state of Kansas's decision, ordering the Carr brothers to be resentenced to death.
And it said the judge's ruling is in line with what the Supreme Court has said in this case.
There's no lack of clarity in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said we find him guilty and we affirm his sentence as for death on count 2. So his point is, if the Supreme Court understood it, and they're not asking me to resentence it, what authority do I have to resentence? And he found he had none.
The lawyers for both men said they plan to appeal because both were sentenced to death. This case is required to go through an extensive legal process, including multiple different kinds of appeals.
For now, at least, the Carr brothers remain on death row. On April 15, 2013, thousands of spectators lined the streets of Boston, cheering on runners as they crossed the finish line of the 117th Boston Marathon.
Have a great race, everybody!
But in a matter of seconds, the joyous celebration turned into chaos. 2 powerful explosions erupted near the finish line, sending shrapnel flying and causing devastation unlike anything the city had ever seen. The bombs, crudely constructed from pressure cookers, ball bearings, and nails, were designed to inflict maximum damage. 3 innocent people lost their lives, including an 8-year-old boy, and over 280 others were injured. Many of them were left with life-altering wounds, including the loss of arms and legs. As smoke filled the air and sirens blared, law enforcement raced against time to find the perpetrators. The entire country held its breath, desperate for answers. What followed was one of the most intense manhunts in U.S. history. There were 2 people responsible, Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. But first, to understand how 2 brothers could become filled with so much hatred that they decided to plan an attack that would change hundreds of lives forever, we have to start at the beginning. The Tsarnaev brothers were born in Russia to a family of Chechen descent and spent their childhoods moving from Kyrgyzstan to Russia before finally seeking asylum in the United States. Their early lives seemed pretty normal. Dzhokhar was a well-liked college student with a talent for wrestling, while Tamerlan had once pursued a career in boxing. But beneath the surface, a dangerous transformation was taking place. Tamerlan, the older brother, had grown extremely radical over the years. He abandoned his Olympic boxing dreams, turned to extreme religious beliefs, and began showing signs of deep resentment toward the United States, the same country that had given him refuge. In 2011, authorities from one country warned the FBI that he might be involved in extremist activities, but the investigation was closed due to a lack of evidence. Dzhokhar, on the other hand, was an all-American teenager. He was charismatic, popular, and seemingly normal, but he was also deeply influenced by his older brother, and when Tamerlan decided to act on his violent ideology, Dzhokhar followed without hesitation. On the day of the marathon, the Tsarnaev brothers walked through the cheering crowds, each carrying a backpack loaded with explosives. Surveillance footage later revealed the chilling moment when they placed their bombs and calmly walked away. Dzhokhar was wearing a white cap and standing near a group of children, and Tamerlan was near the finish line.
There were no known threats of an attack that day, and nothing seemed suspicious about the 2 men wearing backpacks who made their way through the crowd.
Then, at 2:49 p.m., the first bomb exploded.
What the hell was that?
Heads turned at the sound of the first blast, about 200 yards away.
Oh my God! Something blew up! Something blew up! Oh my God, something happened!
Then just 12 seconds later came the second one.
We are watching this come in as you are, and this has occurred just in the last half hour or so. There'll be a lot more that we know here shortly. We have our correspondents on the telephone talking with various people. We spoke to some people at our affiliate station WBZ who told us that there were at least 2 explosions.
Shocked and horrified, people all around the nation watched the live footage of the scene, trying to make sense of what was going on. They didn't know if this was some horrific accident or if the country was under attack.
Scott, I think we have to be very careful here at the outset to tell people that we don't have a very complete picture at all of what's going on in Boston. The information is very, very preliminary, and right now the federal government is just getting ramped up in the sense of getting all of its command centers and control rooms together to try to figure out what this is. The preliminary cut of information, and I emphasize capital P preliminary, there are about a dozen people hurt. That's the first word back to the federal government. about a dozen people hurt, no confirmed fatalities right now. So far, and we don't know whether this was an accident, a natural gas explosion, or something more sinister, there have been no claims of any kind of responsibility. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but as a starting point.
The aftermath was sheer devastation. Limbs were torn from bodies, blood covered the sidewalks, and screams filled the air. In the chaos, the brothers blended into the panicked crowd and disappeared.
What struck you about it?
Just the magnitude of it. It wasn't something small. It wasn't something insignificant.
Within minutes, more than 1,000 police and federal law enforcement agents would embark on the largest investigation and manhunt of its kind in the United States.
For days, law enforcement scoured through thousands of surveillance images and videos. Finally, there was a breakthrough. There was footage captured of the two brothers calmly walking away from the blast site. Their images were released to the public, and suddenly, all of Boston was on edge. The Tsarnaevs knew their time was running out. They needed more weapons, so they ambushed and executed an MIT police officer named Sean Collier in a failed attempt to steal his gun. Then, they carjacked a man, even confessing their crimes to him before he made a daring escape and alerted the cops. Using the vehicle's GPS, authorities tracked them down in Watertown, Massachusetts. What followed was an all-out war in the streets. The cops exchanged gunfire with the brothers, who hurled homemade explosives at officers.
They have explosives, some type of grenades. They're in between houses down here. Shots fired.
Tamerlan was eventually tackled to the ground, but in a shocking turn of events, Dzhokhar, trying to escape, ran him over with their stolen SUV, dragging his body under the wheels before speeding away. Tamerlan was dead, but Dzhokhar, now gravely injured after being shot by the cops, wasn't finished yet. With the city under lockdown, thousands of officers swarmed the streets. For hours, there was no sign of Dzhokhar. But then, a Watertown resident noticed blood on his backyard boat. He was obviously aware of the manhunt that was going on and wondered if this could possibly be connected. Immediately, he called the cops, who did believe that Dzhokhar was likely hiding inside the boat. Authorities moved in, using thermal imaging to confirm that the fugitive was really there. Flashbangs were thrown, commands were shouted, and finally at 8:42 p.m. Dzhokhar surrendered, wounded and bleeding. He was taken into custody.
You see them right here. These are images never seen before of the capture of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev from that boat that was in the backyard of that house in Watertown, Massachusetts on April 19th, a night none of us will really ever forget. These are some pictures, again, never seen before of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's capture. Sergeant Murphy said that he wanted people to see this as the face of terrorism and not that Rolling Stone cover. A couple of quotes from him that he felt that this was insulting. Quote, "I hope that people who see these images will know that this was real. It was as real as it gets." And he believes this is the better image of terrorism than that Rolling Stone cover.
This is the infamous Rolling Stone magazine cover featuring the Boston Marathon bomber that shocked the world and insulted many. Family members of the victims found the cover distasteful and as if it was glorifying a murderer. It was a very different image of the killer than the ones taken at the scene when he was first captured.
Wolf, again, let's look at these pictures again. You see, in this one in particular, the laser scope paint of basically the targeting of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev on his head. They've got the laser scope from their rifles on his head as he emerges from that boat. Very, very dramatic. You see him pulling his shirt up when they asked him to, they asked him to do that to make sure he had no weapons on him. So he does that with the laser scopes on his head. There's a picture of him climbing out of the boat. You see him swinging his leg over the boat right there. There is another picture of him with a laser scope on it.
The nightmare that had terrified all of Boston was finally over, but still justice would need to be served. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev faced 30 federal charges, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction. His trial was one that was followed by people all around the world. All of the nation tuned in when the verdict was eventually reached.
We're coming on the air briefly right now because the jury has reached a verdict in the trial of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the young man who, along with his brother Tamerlan, terrorized the city of Boston by setting off dual bombs at Boston's Marathon, a historic event, on April 15, 2013. 3 people were killed, 260 injured, and the jury has now found Tsarnaev guilty on the first of 30 counts on which he is facing. That count is using a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. This is a charge that carries the potential of a death penalty.
Many of the family members of the victims and those who survived the horrific ordeal wanted to see Dzhokhar receive the maximum possible punishment for this despicable act that transformed the lives of so many people forever. In 2015, they got their wish.
The jury deciding the fate of Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev has reached a verdict. They have sentenced him to death. 7 men and 5 women reached this decision after about 14 hours of deliberations and after finding Tsarnaev guilty of all 30 charges against him.
Though his sentence was briefly overturned in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court later reinstated it. Today, he sits on death row at a supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, awaiting execution. 2 pairs of brothers, 2 ruthless crime sprees, and countless lives forever changed. The Carr brothers left a trail of devastation in Wichita, unleashing unimaginable terror on their innocent victims before justice finally caught up with them. Meanwhile, the Tsarnaev brothers transformed a day of triumph in Boston into a scene of horror, shattering lives in an instant. Both cases are haunting reminders of how ordinary people can find themselves face to face with unthinkable evil. These cases leave us with some difficult questions. What drives people to commit such heinous acts? Could anything have stopped them before they reached the point of no return? And perhaps most chillingly, are there others out there right now, walking among us, harboring the same darkness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe justice was served in these cases? And how do you think society can prevent tragedies like these in the future? Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.